Our next session is our first spotlight of the day, meaning a one-on-one interview. This is OFAC and ransomware, and we are really grateful to be joined by Michael Lieberman, Assistant Director for Enforcement at OFAC at the U.S. Department of the Treasury. So Michael has a broad range of experience at Treasury, including roles as Acting Deputy Assistant Secretary for Global Affairs, Director for Europe, Russia, and Iran, and Senior Advisor to the Assistant Secretary for Terrorist Financing. And he's currently a term member on the Council of Foreign Relations. He's joining us today from Washington, D.C., possibly from the steps of the Treasury building, unclear. Michael, again, super grateful to you and to OFAC for joining us today. Can't wait to hear more about what your office is working on now. Welcome.
Thank you. Great to be here.
And also, I'm very pleased to welcome our moderator, Natasha Kohne. Natasha is a partner at Akin Gump, where she co-leads the firm's cybersecurity, privacy, and data protection practice. She's based out of both San Francisco and Abu Dhabi, has a truly global practice handling investigations and disputes across the Middle East, Europe, and North America. With her international practice, she dedicates significant time helping global clients navigate complex cross-border cybersecurity issues that involve OFAC and DOJ and various other law enforcement agencies and international government bodies. Natasha is joining us today from San Francisco. Welcome, Natasha.
Thank you, Bruce. Great to be here.
Really appreciate you moderating this session. Let me turn it over to you.
Absolutely. Thank you, Michael. It's a pleasure to be speaking with you, and thanks again for joining us. You have a very long and impressive history with Treasury, and as the sanctions area continues to intersect more with cyber and ransomware, we're very interested in hearing your views. Now, Treasury has been extremely active this past year in issuing all sorts of guidance, but I'd like to start out really with the updated OFAC advisory issued in September of last year on ransomware, which builds on the previous advisory that OFAC published in October of 2020. The new guidance reemphasizes specific mitigating steps that companies can take to potentially lead to leniency in enforcement actions. And in particular, the advisory emphasized that self-initiated reporting of a ransomware event to any of the U.S. government agencies listed in the advisory would be considered a voluntary disclosure and a significant mitigating factor in any OFAC enforcement decision. So can you just share with us a little bit the impetus for Treasury to issue this updated advisory and why it felt that it was necessary to issue another advisory, sort of re-emphasizing similar issues from before?
Well, thank you, Natasha. Great to be here with you. Thank you, Bruce. Thanks to our audience. Really appreciate the opportunity to speak to everybody today. Let me just begin with a brief caveat that I'm speaking in my personal capacity, informed by my views and experience gained through my position. But to your question, Natasha, when the new administration came in, it really began to focus intently on this issue. And that's in response to the increase in the severity of the threat that we faced. In the first half of 2021, ransomware payments in the United States reached almost $600 million. And that's compared to a little over $400 million in the same period the year before. And to effectively counter ransomware attacks, it was really seen as essential that the US government understand the full extent and nature of such incidents. And that's critical because, as we all know, the US government does not have a monopoly on data in the cyber and crypto ecosystem. And so by reporting ransomware attacks as soon as possible, the United States can gain broader situational awareness, assist law enforcement in countering these bad actors. And victims can also sometimes increase the likelihood of recovering access to their data through other means. And so at the very beginning, all agencies were tasked with identifying ways to counter ransomware activity, including by increasing ransomware reporting. And so the updated advisory, which reflects OFAC's unique role and authorities, was one of Treasury's many contributions to this effort and one of many responses by the US government. And as you noted, we updated the advisory really for two principal reasons: to really increase that reporting and cooperation with US government agencies, as well as to try to promote the improvement of cybersecurity practices to prevent such attacks in the first place, somewhat on the theory that the best offense in this case is a good defense.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I think we'll talk a little bit about the whole of government approach that you sort of briefly touched upon in your answer. So, I know it's only been 4 months since the updated advisory. I mean, is the jury still out as to whether this sort of re-emphasis on self-reporting as a significant mitigating factor has made a difference in combating ransomware? So, for example, in the a number of disclosures that have been made, the type of information you're receiving, or have you seen a change in behavior by the victims or the facilitators? So just for example, in our practice, we have seen some insurance companies that have instituted additional safeguards before payments are made, or in particular bolstering hygiene requirements for cyber. So anything you can tell us that you've seen have changed, whether in the last 4 months or in the last year?
Well, we've seen some of that as well, and we've seen some incident responders take somewhat more cautious approach in some instances to events that might entail greater sanctions risks. We don't have the quantitative data yet for last year, but I would say that I think a major success so far is that the advisory provided additional clarity with respect to what victims and facilitators can expect when making ransomware payments. Of course, attribution is very difficult. And, I think one of the key takeaways from the advisory is that we're not looking to play gotcha in the event that a sanctions nexus is later determined or confirmed. The intent is really that the decisions will be made accounting for the risk that a payment might be to a sanctioned person, and this entail an enforcement action, but really also intends to shift the response, broadly speaking, more towards prevention and protection, which really goes to a key message that our Deputy Secretary delivered at remarks last year, which is that enforcement is not our preference. And so to that end, the feedback we received from industry, this is anecdotal, but is that the advisory has been helpful. It has, as we've heard, enhanced predictability and facilitated planning for incident response. And we've also seen the disclosures that have come in about potential sanctions-related payments also be come in at a greater pace and also be quite fulsome and detailed. And we've seen that it's not just being shared with us, but also with law enforcement. And so, if we can continue those trends, then I think we would count the advisory as having done at least part of its job.
Okay, well, that's good to hear. That's good news. So I'm going to throw out a couple sanctions questions for you. You are a sanctions lawyer. So in the ransomware context, we know time is of the essence. You have a fast-paced, moving environment. So it is difficult for companies to connect the attacker to a sanctioned person prior to making the ransomware payment. Obviously, there's sort of limited identifying information available. So I think it would be helpful for the audience to sort of lay out what Treasury recommends as a best practices approach to helping companies guard against payments made to sanctions persons. I mean, particularly in environments when it's a very quick timeline, there is not lengthy deliberations, and you can't conduct a lot of research.
Sure. Well, if it's helpful, maybe I could just take a step back and give a brief overview of OFAC and OFAC sanctions, just in case many of the audience are not sanctions lawyers, and for your sake, I hope they're not. No offense, Natasha. I was one myself, so I include myself. But let me just say, OFAC authorities are strict liability, which means that a person subject to OFAC jurisdiction can be held civilly liable, even if they didn't have reason to know that it was engaging in a transaction prohibited under sanctions laws and regulations. And there are really two categories of potential violations that arise in this context. They could be payments to blocked persons, designated nationals who we have listed on our specially designated nationals list. But there can also be payments to persons in sanctioned jurisdictions such as Iran, North Korea, Crimea, potentially Cuba, Syria. And payments to any persons in those jurisdictions would be potentially sanctionable as well. So that said, although the authorities are strict liability, we do follow our enforcement guidelines in adjudicating cases that come before us, which means that we look at a variety of factors, including the degree of willfulness or recklessness, the individual circumstances of a company or an organization, the harm to our sanctions programs, and other criteria. And I would just commend to anybody who's interested our recent virtual currency brochure, which we released late last year, which lays out our approach to enforcement in a way that's specifically addressed to the cyber community. In terms of best practices, I would say that, first and foremost, the advisory really reemphasizes the U.S. government position, which is that we strongly discourage companies and citizens from paying ransom or paying similar demands, and really recommends focusing on defense and resilience measures to prevent and protect against such attacks. Now that said, we also recommend a broad risk-based compliance program to mitigate exposure. And so that means when, as you noted, in a fast-paced sort of crisis like a cyber attack, what we would encourage firms to do is to really employ the digital forensics and technical means available to them to determine where the attacker is based, and to the extent that they can determine it, who they are. This is another advantage of reporting to law enforcement, is that sometimes law enforcement will have information that it can share that can help inform a company's assessments in this respect. We really point to the recommendations by our technical sister agencies in terms of other types of best practices, such as those recommended by CISA in its ransomware guide. I would say also that in the event that a payment is made to an unknown person, undetermined person who could be a sanctioned actor or related thereto, that companies really do document the due diligence steps they took. And if they come in to us with a voluntary disclosure, they come into law enforcement, they show us, well, here's what we know, here's what we didn't know, here is our assessment, and that will certainly factor into to our response.
Okay, thank you. That's very helpful. And we know that some of the criminals designated on the SDN list have engaged in ransomware attacks through virtual currency transactions. And some of these criminals use sophisticated technological means like VPNs or the layering of virtual currency transactions through non-sanctioned digital wallets in order to avoid detection. So, my sanctions lawyers want to know, what are Treasury or the interagency partners doing to identify and designate ransomware criminals who try to circumvent sanction restrictions?
Sure. Well, I can speak for Treasury, and as with all Treasury designations, OFAC designations, we do take a strategic approach. It's not our intent to curb or otherwise disrupt legitimate uses of virtual currency that are used in the same way as fiat currency. We're instead targeting virtual currency actors in the same way that we target others, which are those that really contribute to malign activity identified by Treasury's authorities. And our preference really, again, is for the financial industry to include, all intermediaries to police itself and to protect itself and the broader VC ecosystem from these sorts of bad actors. And so we really do look to the private sector to establish safeguards and to conduct the due diligence and the KYC and abide by the various regulations applicable to them. So in terms of who we are targeting, bad actors such as SUEX and CHEDX, we're going to continue focusing on the dark underbelly of the virtual currency ecosystem. That includes mixing services, darknet markets, exchanges that are used to launder or cash out illicit funds for any malign activity. And our hope is that by exposing them and by providing what information we can assist the private sector to, as I said, police itself.
Great. All right. Well, and can you talk a little bit about the SUEX and CHEDX a bit? I know that they were blocked, and I think it was SUEX that actually was the first sort of virtual currency exchange that was blocked. Can Can you talk a little bit about whether you sort of expect these virtual exchanges, if this is just a starting point, or if in particular this area is going to be more of a focus in the future?
Yeah, thank you. I think we do want to continue to identify and target bad actors. There are a number of ways that the U.S. government does so. Treasury designations are not the only type of response. Sometimes they're not the appropriate response. And so, when I spoke about a strategic approach, when we're looking to take these sorts of actions, we're looking at, what message are we sending to the industry, and how will that help it, again, to ensure that help promote the protection against the exploitation by these bad actors, by the vast majority of actors who are legitimate and who want to do the right thing. And so in our actions against SUIX and ChedX, we targeted these entities because of the role that they played, because we saw them not only as bad actors in themselves, but also representing a type, or sort of a typology of activity that we wanted to really send a message about. And so I think along the lines of what I mentioned with respect to these sorts of facilitators of malign activity, those are the kinds of companies we're going to want to see. We're going to be targeting on the SDN list, but we're also looking again to the private sector to be identifying these guys for us, reporting these guys for us, not allowing them to use your exchanges to nest in your ecosystems, and to establish the same sorts of protections that we've seen financial institutions grow to learn to establish and implement over much longer time period. We're really in the early days here, and our message to the industry again is that the fact that it's new and that it's extraordinarily complicated doesn't alleviate the responsibility to establish the protections against these sorts of actors. And by calling these guys out in particular, and maybe others in the future, we're going to be working with industry to send that message, to clarify who the types of bad actors that they should be looking out for, and hopefully kind of skinny the number of such folks down to a manageable few.
Got it. Okay. Well, let's shift to this term whole of government approach. I think that term is being thrown around as an approach to ransomware, and perhaps November 8th might be the best example of the whole of government approach working. It was fully on display. You had DOJ, Treasury, State, all announced major actions, in particular against this prolific ransomware group, Revil, and you had arrests and indictments and $6.1 million in funds seized, and Treasury sanctioned actors for part in ransomware incidents. So recognizing that this was a very impressive day and maybe an anomaly, are you seeing already a change in interagency cooperation and multilateral government cooperation that's really making a difference?
Well, I must say that in my nearly 10 years at Treasury, the response to the ransomware threat has really galvanized about as organized and cooperative and truly joint interagency approach is about any I've seen in that time. And just within Treasury, it really is a whole of department effort, bringing together the insurance office, domestic finance, IT, FinCEN, OFAC, Office of Terrorist Financing, international affairs, and that is really being replicated across the whole U.S. government. I think it's really a credit to the leadership that's recognized how complex, how multifaceted this challenge is, and everybody's. It's really been all hands on deck, I think, in a truly integrated fashion. And so, I hope that the actions of that day are not a unique event. There is, of course, a lot of activity going on behind the scenes that's doesn't make the headlines, but actions like that, are important, both to disrupt this bad activity and to also, assure the public that the U.S. government is really focused on this issue and doing its best. I would say that internationally as well, we're seeing similar types of cooperation and success, bringing together partners in Europe, Israel, South Korea, elsewhere to act against these bad actors. And, speaking of the ChAdX designation, for example, we saw that day Latvia and Estonia also take action against ChAdX and its enabling companies. And relationships like that, working together also to improve international financial standards so that countries that are hosts to exchanges and actors in the ecosystem establish the standards and the rules and the regulations they need to enforce and to regulate appropriately is also key. And so we're seeing really a lot of success in terms of advancing, improving, modernizing the standards in the Financial Action Task Force, in the G7 Cyber Expert Group, and other bodies that are critical to this effort. And so I think it's a reflection that these kind of in some ways, are modern day pirates, hostile to the entire sort of legitimate economy, and actors great and small, not just the big companies that are being targeted. Of course, it's, small mom and pop companies. My father was an ophthalmologist, just learned about an attack on an ophthalmology office. It's local governments, it's local public school systems, and not just obviously in the United States. And so really the nature of the threat has really lent itself, I think, to this cooperation. And, I think that the cooperation, always needs to be improved, but it's really, moving hopefully to where it needs to be.
Right. And I think it was reported that at least 17 law enforcement agencies around the world were involved. I don't know if that's something that a statistic that you have at the, on you, but that seems like a remarkable, number of government agencies that were potentially involved. So, well, we only have one more minute left, or a couple more minutes left. So, I'll throw out just one last question. If you are, what types of trends, do you anticipate seeing in 2022? Obviously, in 2021, we saw ransomware as a service proliferate, double extortion, ransom payments skyrocket. But we also saw some major victories. Love to hear from your personal perspective, what you might anticipate in 2022, or just leave us with some parting thoughts if that's easier.
Sure. Well, thank you. And I would hope that we do see more victories and decrease in the threat and the number of attacks. I think that, maybe more pessimistically, we're probably going to see the threat continue to evolve, targeting perhaps new types of operating systems, perhaps different types of firms or utilities in a way that we might not have seen to this degree yet. This trend maybe towards, triple extortion. I'm afraid that it might get worse before it gets better. And so, I think that's really one of the reasons why we've worked so hard to partner with industry, like many in our audience today, to work with us to counter this challenge. I wish I could leave it on a more optimistic note, but I think we've got to soldier on for a little while yet.
I think that's probably exactly right. Thank you, Michael. It was a pleasure speaking with you. Really insightful comments today.
Thank you, Natasha. Thank you, everybody.
Yeah, thank you, Natasha. Great job moderating. We really appreciate it. And Michael, it's so important to hear from OFAC in this ransomware discussion now. Really appreciate you joining us and giving us your insights. Thank you so much.